In today's video I'll be building a mid-range computer that's perfect for home use. I was working to a budget of about £550, so every component had to be picked to get the best balance of performance and price. So first let's have a look at the motherboard, as that's at the heart of the system. This is an ASRock B85M ITX motherboard. It supports 4th generation Intel Core i7, i5 and i3 processors. As the name would suggest, this motherboard is built around the B85 chipset. This is actually one of the lower end chipsets currently available, but it's more than enough for this machine. At the higher end of motherboards based around the H87 and Z87 chipsets. These provide additional features that can be useful when building servers or gaming rigs. For a home computer though, the features that are provided really aren't necessary, such as additional serial ATA ports or being able to split the PCI lanes. At the lower end, the motherboard is built around the H81 chipset. I couldn't find many motherboards using this chipset at the moment, but it is still fairly new.
On the back connection panel of the motherboard we have a PS2, two USB 2s, a DVI, a VGA, HDMI, two USB 3s, external serial ATA, two more USB 2s, an RJ45 for Ethernet, an optical audio output, 5 other audio outputs.
Over the years I've built my fair share of computers in cheap cases, and let me tell you, it's just not worth it. You invariably end up getting cut on the sharp edges, and there's never anywhere to tie back cables. For this build I've gone for a Cooler Master Elite 130. This is quite a large case for a mini ITX based system, but it has some benefits such as being able to take a full-sized ATX power supply and having room for an optical drive.
Now open the case by removing the 3 thumb screws on the back and sliding the top off. Fit 4 brass standoffs ready to accept the motherboard. This case comes with a handy little adapter that fits over the standoff. This allows you to use a screwdriver to screw it down. The case is now prepared, so put it to one side and unpack the processor. Notice that the chip has no pins. These are located in the socket on the motherboard. The processor comes with a stock heatsink and fan, which is perfectly adequate for a build like this and very easy to fit. I have however decided to fit a simple pre-filled water cooling system, which should make the machine run a little more quietly. To fit the processor, first remove the protective cap from the socket and put it somewhere safe. Unhook the lever and open the socket. Pick up the processor by the edge and orientate it so that the notches line up with those in the socket. Place the processor in the socket and touch the back lightly to ensure it's seated correctly. Close the socket, ensuring the retaining frame is under the pin on the motherboard. Next, fit the memory. In my experience, cheap memory is unreliable over the long term, so spend a few pounds extra and get something with a heatsink attached. Avoid the top of the range items, as these are expensive and won't provide any benefit to a system like this. In this build I'm fitting two 4GB DDR3 modules to give 8GB in total. This is the minimum I would fit to a machine. First, open the retaining clips on the memory sockets. Pick up a stick of memory by the top and align the cutout with the bar across the socket. Slide the stick of memory down into the socket between the retaining clips and press down. The retaining clips will automatically close to lock the stick into place. Now unpack the water cooling system. This cooler will work with a wide range of both Intel and AMD processors, and because of that it comes with a lot of different fittings. Check the instructions to see which fittings you need to use. The system is pre-filled with fluid and factory sealed, which makes it as easy to work with as the stock cooling system. The next thing to do is build the bracket for the heatsink. The bracket works with both AMD and Intel processors, so be sure to work from the correct side. Slide a silver mounting pin through the appropriate hole, ensuring the arrow is pointing out, and then use a black retaining clip to hold it in place. For this processor, the clip needs to be slid to the second locking position, but it varies depending on the processor, so check the instructions. Flip the bracket over and clip the pin up into the retaining clip. The pin is then locked and shouldn't fully rotate. Finally, fit the bracket to the motherboard. Flip the motherboard over and carefully slide the mounting pins through the holes. If a mounting pin doesn't align correctly, check that the retaining clip is in the correct position. The next step is to fit the motherboard into the case, but before you do that, fit the I/O shield into the back of the case. The I/O shield simply presses into place, but it can be a little tricky to get in. Take care not to bend it. Next, place the motherboard into the case. Try to put it straight down onto the standoffs rather than sliding it in. Use 4 screws to lock the motherboard into place. You'll have to press it against the I/O shield to line the holes. In order to fit the water cooling system, it is necessary to remove the 120mm fan at the front of the case. The front of the case pulls off, but note that it is very tightly attached. The front fan is held in with 4 expanding clips which are just pulled out. Now fit the water cooling system. Pass the cooling block all the way through the case and have it stick out the far side before then putting the radiator into the case. This way there's no danger of the cooling block swinging around and damaging the motherboard while you fit the radiator. Note the direction of airflow arrows on the fan. I will set this fan up to blow air into the case, even though that will mean the air is slightly warmed by the radiator. This is to keep a positive pressure inside the case and minimise dust build-up. The radiator is held into place by long screws which go through the fan and the case. I found it quite difficult to get all the screws lined up and engaging in the radiator as they're only just long enough. Take out the optical drive plate and refit the front of the case. With the water cooling system in the case, it's time to fit the cooling block to the processor. Apply a little thermal grease to the top of the CPU. I was a bit generous here. Now fit the cooling block to the CPU. I would normally fit the cooling block so that the pipes ran near the fan at the side of the case. Due to the layout of the components on the motherboard though, I had to have the cooling pipes near the memory. The cooling block is held in place by a retaining bracket and 4 thumb screws. Use a flat-headed screwdriver to finish the tightening of the thumb screws. Take care not to over-tighten the screws, but at the same time they have to be quite tight to achieve good thermal contact between the processor and the cooling block. Unpack and fit the solid-state drive. The drive could potentially be placed in 5 different locations in this case, but I selected under the optical drive tray as the most convenient. Use 2 fine threaded short screws to lock the drive into place. Don't use regular case screws as they have the wrong thread and are too long. Open the locking lever for the optical tray and slide in the optical drive. Close the lock and optionally fit 2 screws on the other side of the tray. The motherboard I'm using in this build only has 2 fan headers and both will be used by the water cooling system. The fan should be connected to the CPU header and the pump connected to the case header. It is important that the 2 connectors are plugged into the correct fan headers. The fan needs to be on the CPU header so that the BIOS can alter the fan speed based on the temperature of the processor. The case header should be set to permanent maximum speed in the BIOS since it's powering the pump. To fit the power supply, first remove the bracket from the back of the case and screw it to the power supply. Feed the cables into the case, slide in the power supply and insert 4 screws to hold it in place. Note that depending on the layout of the connectors in the motherboard and other components, you may or may not be able to make all the connections with the power supply in place. For this motherboard I actually had to slide the power supply back out in order to connect the 12 volt line. Now connect all the components to the motherboard and power supply. For the most part there is only one location and orientation for each cable that is required. For simplicity of setup, try to ensure that the solid state disk is in serial ATA port 0, as this is usually checked first by the BIOS. Pay special attention to the case connectors and refer to the motherboard manual. These small connectors can be connected to the wrong pins. At this point I normally power the machine up to check that everything's working correctly. If there are any problems, it's much easier to rectify them now rather than after all the cables have been tied down. Since there were no obvious problems, I went ahead and tied the cables. My main aim was to clear the centre of the case to allow a free flow of air from front to back. Finally, refit the top of the case. The machine is now ready to have the operating system and other software installed.